talk about a serious thing today, and it's kind of an emotional thing. And it's like, what happens when your best donor isn't really giving, or they're giving to other places in the community, and you're like, what happened? That should be coming to us.
Right. I mean,
And
talk about major FOMO.
yeah, it's true. It's true. And this really, I want to share with everybody. This conversation, this idea for a show came from a real conversation I had with a major organization in my community that does the work of the angels. And they started really looking around at some of their big donors and how they were giving to other organizations to a much greater extent. And so they were like, what the heck is going on? And why is this happening to us, type of thing. And so I was like, I'm going to really drill down on this with Tony, because it's such an important concept, and it's happening to everyone. We get to have these conversations, and sometimes we laugh and sometimes we cry because we have amazing partners, and they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Intuit QuickBooks. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Again, joined by Tony Beall, Mr. Nonprofit Consultancy, which we are very honored that he gives us his time each and every Friday. Tony's the one that actually discovered this. We were voted #1 best philanthropy podcast in the US by Million Podcasts. They ranked 100 different podcasts, and we came up #1. And we just want to say thank you. It's really an impressive thing for all of us here on this team.
So Julia, real quickly about that, a pro tip for everyone is check your spam box, because the notification that we had received this recognition landed in my spam box. So if I had not taken time to go through my spam inbox, I would have missed the announcement. It would have been a mystery.
Well, and so thank you for sharing that, because we have 7 co-hosts, and you, with the last name, starting with a B, you came up first. And so you got that notification where others within our organization didn't. And so that was really an interesting thing that happened. And so anyway, thank you for being on the lookout, and thank you for our viewers and folks today that have acknowledged that. I mean, it's really important. Well, let's get to this big question, because we have a lot to talk about today. Scenario number 1, you've got the same donor giving far more to another organization. And you mentioned this in the green room. It's a FOMO issue. Fear of missing out, because you are missing out. What do you see when this happens?
Yeah, this probably happens more than we realize. And the organization that you referenced was smart enough to explore the landscape and really see what's going on with their donors. A lot of times, we spend time in our own data, but we're not kind of looking outside of our own organization in terms of what our donors are doing. So that's just a really great reminder to folks that are watching or listening. Invest some time in really understanding the full profile of your donor, not just the profile that exists within your organization. Mm-hmm. I would say, this is how I would approach this. I would acknowledge that I know that the donor has given this gift to another organization, and I would celebrate it. So I would just bring it up by saying, I saw, I heard, I witnessed, I heard, however it is, that you gave this gift to XYZ organization. Mm-hmm. That is fantastic. Thank you for doing that, because their mission and what they do is so important to our community. And just kind of start the conversation there. They might say, yeah, well, I didn't expect to give that kind of gift, but there was a matching gift. And so I knew my dollars, you know what I mean? So I knew my dollars were going to be doubled. I didn't expect to do that, but they asked me at this point in time and it seemed right. So you're learning something about that exchange and how that organization got that larger gift. But I would just start by acknowledging the fact that
Yeah.
that gift was made and celebrate it.
You are, as we say in the Southwest, a bueno huevo. You're a good egg because that that is the right thing to do in terms of community building, right? I mean, I love that you said that. And maybe I'm a petty woman, but I didn't go there. I didn't go there first in my mind. I was like, what the hell? I was thinking I was indignant and I was torqued. And why did they do this? But you are right because that impacts the community. It sets a standard. It could be modeled by other people of means, or it's the right thing to do. So thank you for elevating the pettiness and moving it forward. Because you are right, Tony, that you said something really magical, and that is you can listen and learn about why they made that decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot too about just the nuances involved in this work. It's just, again, every individual is exactly that. They're an individual with their own specific needs and goals and desires within philanthropy. So just, honoring that every step of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Well, you're, like I said, you're a bueno huevo. That's the right thing. Okay, so then along that same line, and we know that a particular donor in our portfolio or in our orbit that we have a relationship with. I'm not saying going out and chasing the big checkbook, but somebody
Sure.
that we is in our family, so to speak. How do we recognize that they've been an important donor, but that we could move them towards a major gift,
Mhm.
so that we don't, I'm going to call it out, lose it to another organization?
Right. And I think that that's where, again, the importance of the relationship and your connectivity with donors. How often are you communicating with them one on one? So, and I want to say one on one because I don't want it to be misunderstood that when I say communicating with them means, well, I sent all the donors an e-blast today. So, I've communicated with all the donors this month. But really, if you are fortunate in your organization to have a robust portfolio of individual donors, it's all about taking the time to connect with them, again, kind of understanding their needs, desires, and wants within this space.
Mhm.
uh, but it also means being transparent and openly communicating with donors about where your organization is headed and what is the next big thing that they can invest in and be a part of. If you have a strategic plan, have you shared that strategic plan with your large donors in hopes of getting a legacy gift or a larger gift because they have a deeper understanding of where the organization is going and how their investment and contribution can support that growth and
Mhm.
support that larger impact on the community. So again, for me,
Yeah.
it really comes back to the conversations and knowing the donor one on one and sharing information.
Tony, I love that you said that because I can think of, I've never been a paid fundraiser, but I've been a community fundraiser, and I've asked for a lot of money in my community. Haven't always been successful. Sometimes I have grabbed that brass ring. And I mentioned this to you when I first met you 7 years ago. If I had met you 20, 30 years ago, I would have raised millions more for my
Mm.
community. And it's a regret I have. And one of the things that you just said that's super magical to me is, instead of just saying, you've got capacity and we want a bigger check, I love that you put forth that action. If we can get your investment, we can do this. This is what's going to be funded, as opposed to, I think a lot of fundraising is just help us build our coffers.
And depending on your relationship, you can test the water. So maybe part of the conversation is, uh, we are so grateful for your contributions to date, and because of that, this is the impact. how would you feel if I asked you to double that?
Ah,
So again, just depending
yeah.
on, like, I'm not asking you to double it, but how would you feel if I were to ask you to double your contribution, knowing that we could serve another 200 individuals if you were to do that? So,
Yeah.
so
That's
there
good.
are ways to test the waters without making the direct ask. I'm not
Right.
asking you for money, but how would you feel if I did ask you for that?
Yeah, I love that strategy because, again, it deepens the relationship. It might be something that the donor hasn't thought of, or they're like, well, this would fit in this trajectory of my life or my financial cycle. I mean, yeah, I think that's a great way to go. And then you're not beating around the bush, you're being open and transparent, and there's no shame in that.
No,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's cool.
at this point, we're talking about a large donor. So this is somebody
Yeah.
that has a history of giving. They understand philanthropy. They understand what they're investing in. So, don't insult their intelligence by acting like they don't know what your role is in the organization. Uh, so again, I think that, if your relationship is where you hope it is with these donors, you should be able to say something like, how would you feel if I were to ask you to
Yeah.
double your investment?
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great thing. And I think that's an important question in a relationship, no matter where you are. How do
Mhm.
you feel about us? Where does that go? And that's a really cool way to do it. I also think that for a fundraiser, and maybe I'm just speaking like for myself, that's a lot less risky. That doesn't make me fear like, oh, I'm going to ask for the big check. Because I've done that. I've had to amp myself up for that ask. But
Mhm.
having that conversation and saying how would you feel? I
Mhm.
love that. I think that's brilliant for everybody, right?
Yeah, for
For
sure.
everybody, and not just that donor.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
that's cool. Okay, so one and two, great answers, great strategy. I mean, let's see if we can like stump the panel, as I like to say, because this is a little dicey. And this is another thing that happens. And again, because I'm a petty woman, I have probably have a different answer. Scenario number three: a major donor commits a legacy gift to another organization. And I'm going to put in the caveat that it's an organization that kind of does the same work that your organization's doing. It's in that same wheelhouse.
Mhm.
How should we think about this?
Again, I think that we have to look at it still from a place of gratitude that this individual is investing in our community,
Yeah.
and folks, next door to us may benefit from the services. We just don't know, right? So I still think you have to come at it from a place of gratitude. And I feel kind of the same way I did with the first answer. It's, you lean in and you say, I saw, I heard, I witnessed that you made a legacy gift to an organization that does similar work that we do. I just want to thank you because, our mission is important, their mission is important. And find out, find ways to learn something from the experience. I
Yeah.
mean, again, maybe even ask, like, what was it about their mission that
Yeah.
motivated you to want to leave a legacy? Was it a new program? So, ask the questions, but make sure that you're coming from this place of gratitude, and really this place of lifelong learning. Like,
Yeah.
I'm really asking you these questions because I want to learn
Mhm.
where I might have. I'm not going to verbalize this, but in my head, I'm like, I'm asking you these questions because I want to learn where I could have done something differently.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's no shame in that because to your point, what you can learn from, that conversation will embolden you in other ways, other conversations. I'm thinking, Tony, even mindset, right?
Mhm.
Even mindset to say, this is an issue that I need to get over the hurt feelings, because we take it to heart, we take our role so seriously, and it's hurtful. I think it's emotional. Maybe that's the better word. When something like this happens, and we think, well, why wasn't it our organization?
Right. And then we talked in the green room a little bit too about uh, how we as fundraisers can oftentimes under ask. Like
Yes.
we make an ask and we under ask, and so you only get what you ask for.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that maybe that's a learning through this as well. Maybe I never introduced them to legacy gifts for my organization.
Yep.
Maybe that was just something I didn't bring up because maybe this major donor isn't in that age bracket that we tend to put legacy donors in. Again, the nuances and the different scenarios. They could have left a legacy gift and they may be in their, high 30s, low 40s
Right.
in terms of age, but they are forward thinking enough to know that they're going to want to leave a legacy. So again, maybe we didn't bring it up in a conversation. Maybe I never let that donor know that that was an opportunity for our organization.
So, Tony, what you just said a moment ago with our previous scenario, would it be appropriate or strategic to kind of use that same framework with what would you think about discussing making a legacy gift with us? I mean, is that the way to frame it as opposed to working on a pitch, and then, throwing it all against the wall? Or is that really more of a tactical way to go?
No, I think that strategy would, I'm kind of playing scenarios through my head right now as we're having the conversation. I think that could work. That, you may not have known that we have a legacy program as well, or
Yeah.
you know what I mean, or
Yeah.
or maybe even be, really humble, really excited. I don't know if I ever mentioned to you that we have a legacy program or that you could leave a legacy gift, with us. If it's not too late, I'd love to share with you what that would mean to our organization and the impact. So, maybe phrase it in some of those different ways.
Okay, now I'm going to go in the Wayback Time Machine with you because we did an episode and I thought it was riveting about crisis asks and
Ah,
crisis management, right? And I'm wondering, for the organization that is always in crisis and always marketing to solve a crisis, that a legacy gift might seem like not a good investment. Or I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but like, oh, your organization A is always seeking funding to solve an immediate problem, where B is looking for the future and towards the stewardship of the organization. I can see legacy gifts seeming like a better deal on that future thinking. Do you see where I'm going with that?
yeah, I see where you're going. I think that we have to be A and B. I mean, when we talk about diversification of funding streams and, grants and individual donors and events and, the whole kind of giving pie, uh, we need to be doing both. We need to be focusing on what are the immediate fundraising needs to, keep the programs running, to keep our commitment to our community activated, and simultaneously having these conversations that will ultimately solidify the work that we're doing today in the
Mhm.
future.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. We have a really interesting comment that came in from a viewer just now, and they write in: a 5-minute phone call from an executive director turned me from a one-time donor into a recurring gift donor. Going the extra little step can do massive things.
Mhm.
And I think that just reinforces so much of what you've just said, and shared with us, and that approach and that mindset. I really appreciate that comment because I think
Yeah,
that's reality.
thank you. Yeah. I'm glad a viewer shared. That's great,
Yeah, that's
and
really
and so
cool.
true. A
It
five
is.
minute phone call.
It is. It humanizes things. And I think what you said too was really interesting because we double, I mean, so much as a fundraiser is going through our brain, and we're trying to be perfect and right and get results and all that. But I think what you said was really interesting when you're like, maybe I didn't mention to you that we have this opportunity. or have I shared with you about this project or this
Mhm.
program? I think there's a way to remind people or get them re-engaged or re-engage ourselves, right? I
Mhm.
mean, because there's so much going on.
Mhm.
So I think that was a cool way to kind of pull that thread forward.
Great.
I want to talk to you in our last, we don't have a lot of time left, but one of our last scenarios. And this is something I'm seeing more and more. You and I have talked about this a little bit over the years. And that is when you get a major donor who really wants to seat somebody, a representative, maybe it's their foundation, maybe it's a child or an heir on a board, on your board. And they want to move that hmm, level of influence, or they want a level of participation into the board composition
Mhm.
discussion. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts on that? And are you seeing that?
I have not seen that very often anymore.
Okay.
If we were having this conversation maybe 15 years ago, I might have been able to give you some real life examples from yesterday
Yeah.
around this. But
Hmm.
you know, folks are wiser. Information is more readily available.
Hmm.
So it's pretty easy to see if someone is in a pay to play scenario. And that's what I consider this. I consider this kind of a pay to play. I'm going to make a donation to your organization. And in return, you will empower me to serve on your board of directors or someone that I designate to serve on your board of directors. And that's just not cool. So uh, I do not see a lot of that happening
Okay.
right now, especially with small and medium sized organizations. Now, if that's happening at higher ed institutions
Yeah.
and stuff, that I'm not aware of, and I might, no shade, I might, think it's happening more at these larger nonprofits, larger national or international nonprofits than it is for smaller, local or organizations.
Hmm.
The other thing, and we did a show about this also, Julia, is what is your gift policy? Do you have a gift
Yeah.
policy? And does that gift policy help you in these scenarios to
Hmm.
where you can turn to that gift policy and say, that a gift, shall not warrant a donor, you know, or seat on the board of directors. You know what I mean? So whatever that
Yeah.
language might look like, I'm having trouble pulling it out of the air today a little bit, but whatever that might look like on your gift policy. But again, making sure that you have one. So when these scenarios pop up, you have something to turn to.
I love it. You said that. And I think that's really a valuable strategy and a reconnection to your own organization. Because in my experience, it is those higher net worth donors and larger gifts that come with strings,
Hmm. Hmm.
maybe imperceptible, maybe laid out.
Right.
And so to have that tool in place is good no matter what size organization you are.
Hmm.
It's just a best practice. But I think you're right. And that's something I had kind of separated off in my mind. But I think you're absolutely correct that that's a tool that you need. And it also helps you get out of some sticky situations.
Sure does. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure does. And the other thing, most organizations have other volunteer opportunities.
Hmm.
Uh, outside of the board of directors, like reminding folks, most boards are volunteer driven.
Yeah.
So if the motivation truly is for their designee to have some professional development opportunities, then then think about what committees do you have? Do you have a task force working on something? Uh,
Mhm.
where else can this individual sit within the organization where they're volunteering their time and getting kind of the professional development experience that the large donor is hoping that they'll have.
Yeah, and that's a great idea. And I think that's a realistic way to navigate this. In my experience, when I've seen this happen, and I've seen this happen a lot in my community, it is the the great idea and spark from the donor that's not really shared with the heir or the that next gen. The kids are like, we don't really want to be here. We don't really want to do this. Or,
Right.
a big corporate sponsor that then seats a junior employee or somebody, and they're kind of like, it's not like, woohoo, yay team, I want to serve, right? Do you see where I'm going with that? It's like you're forced to take on somebody that might have a little reluctance for
Mm-hmm.
stepping up and being a big player with your organization. So, yeah,
Right.
something to think about. Well, this has been a great conversation. It's something that's very important to be talking about this. I loved your mindset, and I think that a lot of what you've said is also reflected in our book, The Architecture of Fundraising. It's how we think about our donors, it's how we think about ourselves, our confidence, how we ask, how we engage, how we build relationships.
Mm-hmm.
This is available on Amazon, $19.99. It's a heck of a deal. It is an amalgamation of many decades between the two of us serving in the nonprofit sector. So check it out. It's a great read, as Tony likes to say.
Yes.
Um,
I always say it's like having a conversation with a trusted friend.
yeah, it is. Well, when I read it, I hear your voice, right? So that's kind of kooky. Um, which is nice, which is, I mean, really nice. So
Mhm.
anyway, if you've got questions, send them our way.
Yeah.
Send your questions. You can reach us out on social. Both of us are very active on LinkedIn, but you can also email us at info@americannonprofitacademy.com. As I like to say, hint, hint, that goes directly to the email box of our executive producer, Kevin Pace. And so pitch away and send questions. And then, yeah. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Hey, our thanks and our major applause also goes out to our presenting sponsors. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the people that support us as we are very close to reaching our 1,600th episode of
Wow.
the Nonprofit Show. I know that's even for me. That's like a wow moment. But anyway, Tony, we've had a really busy summer so far. I know you just had a big event in your community. You can check out the images from Tony's work on his LinkedIn page. And we like to end with this message because I think it's really important for all of us to listen to and to hear. And it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.